Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Smaller audience for a much more interesting topic. We've seen the four freedoms of software, but we live in a material world, and when matter comes in, it gets dirty. And that's what these people actually are doing. They're getting their hands dirty, but trying to transfer the four freedoms of software into a similar set of freedoms in the material world. But we all know and have written and read about that it probably would be naive to just copy software principles and apply them one-to-one in the hardware world, because we've got this nasty, dirty issue of materiality. So please welcome with me Jürgen Neumann, representing the Open Hardware and Design Alliance, Massimo Menichinelli, a designer who's studying and practicing open in design, Alison Powell, who's coming from a more media communication society perspective and looking into what does this transformation actually mean in society. And then, last not least, Dannie Jost, who is coming from the World Trade Institute and has a lot of experience on patenting, and she will probably trying to tell us why patents actually are good, at least to some extent. Jürgen, please.
Yeah, hello, thank you for coming. I'm very happy to take you on a hopefully interesting journey on a shift that we are trying to make during this conference. In the afternoon, we will have a workshop that will lead us further on our road. I actually come out of a world of hackers and free software, and a bit naive, we started to think about how we could apply the four freedoms that the Free Software Foundation has developed so greatly into the world of open source hardware or hardware. And the first approach we took was that we were thinking maybe we can apply copyleft, but of course we cannot because they are based on copyrights, which cannot be put into the physical world. And then I was invited to a workshop in Bern, Canada. It was called GOSH, Grounding Open Source Hardware. And there we came up, or a lawyer came up with the idea, why don't you use a trademark for your purpose? And I want to present to you the outcome of this workshop. It's the Open Hardware and Design Alliance. And then we want to start with the panel and see why this is maybe not the right approach and how we can shift it into something better. Well, that's what we thought we are. We are an initiative that wants to foster the sustainable sharing of open hardware and design. And as I said, in 2009, we had a wonderful meeting in the Rocky Mountains to have a longer talk on these topics. So here's our approach that we took. As you can see, we just replaced the term software with device or design, but it's exactly the description of the four freedoms by the Free Software Foundation. Then we had a longer discussion, like people who are in the physical world always think about that things cost money. And as you may have realized, there's lots of hardware out there which is proclaiming to be open source hardware or open in some ways. And many, especially with electronic hardware, there are some obstacles to it. Like some people say, well, it's the design as such is open, but the PCB layouts are not open, and so on and so forth. Or if you want to go into mass production, we don't want that, or we want to be part of it. And so as Ohanda, we decided to take the full approach. And our understanding of open source hardware is really to gain the right to the users or consumers or redesigners to do whatever they want with this piece of open source hardware that they are holding in their hands. Well, why can't we just use copyleft? As I said before, copyleft is based on copyright, and copyright as such cannot be shifted into the physical world, and hopefully later on the panel you will learn more about why this cannot be done. So our idea was, as suggested by a lawyer, why don't you use a trademark and then apply the trademark to the hardware, and the people who want to make use of the trademark need to promise, so to speak, or accept the terms and conditions of the usage of the trademark, which is granting the four freedoms, and then print the trademark on the hardware itself so that everybody can see that this piece of hardware that you are holding in your hands is meant to be open source hardware. And the second idea was that we have a registration key, the Ohanda key, that will make it possible for the person who holds that device in their hands, that through the key they can find their way to the documentation and to the designer. That's the process that we designed and how we thought this could be done. First of all, the designer makes the design and then applies a copyleft license or a public domain license to the design artifacts for the prototype. Then the designer as a person registers in and gets a key as a person or organization, and also gets a unique producer ID by which he or she can be found over the internet. And by applying or doing this, by registering in, they accept the terms and conditions of applying the four freedoms to their designs. Then the designer will register their product and get the second part of the key, through which you can identify the device on the internet. And maybe the next iteration could be a QR code or something like this. So then in the end, the consumer will see the product with the Ohanda registration key printed on it. He or she will see that it's open source hardware, and through the key and over the website of Ohanda, they can find the product description, the design artifacts, and the license. And empowered by the four freedoms through the designer, the user gains the rights to do whatever they want with the device. Well, that's the way we thought of it, very simple, just a small URL or something. Oh, it's a bit slow, sorry. And that's how we hoped it would look like someday, that amongst other labels or signs, you would see the Ohanda label at the back of your electronic devices or non-electronic hardware. After we launched this, there were already some products that were registered with Ohanda. We started very simply with a wiki, and after a short time, we already had quite an interesting list of things, of products that were registered. And to give you some examples, that you can see the C-Rove, a project by the C-Base as part of the Google Open Moon project, a moon lander, and they already registered their designs with Ohanda. And then from your right, you can see a stove, which a professor from India registered. As you may know, in India, more than 1 million people die year by year due to toxic smoke while they are cooking. And he has built a lot of stoves for optimized burning. And the other example is a laser-based network link system to where you can connect buildings or other things over a distance of 2 kilometers and more. Then the microcontroller is an MIT project. It's the Mini 6 controller from the MIT, which is used to teach students in microprocessor programming. And the last example is the stick, which is from the German Privacy Foundation. It's a USB stick where you can store your passwords safely. And yeah, that was a great starting, as we thought. But then we thought a wiki is a bit poor, so we designed a new website, which is now online. And we are still shifting the products from the wiki to the new website, but now you can register more easily and have a better overview over the products. Also, some people told us that it would be nice to have a small repository of products with more description rather than just a list in the wiki, and so we took this hint and put this on the web. Also, of course, we are thinking about promotion, and as the number of open source hardware devices out there is very poor until today, we thought it's better to pinpoint people to all the closed source devices, like this, for example, or that. And then we made stickers, which I forgot to bring today, and hopefully I will bring them tomorrow, which you can put on everything you would like to see them on. And we have some more ideas. And this was just the initial team that founded the Open Hardware and Design Alliance back in 2009 in the wonderful Rocky Mountains in Canada. So this was my short introduction to where we are at. But as we found out and will find out during the discussion, and hopefully during the workshop that we will have in the afternoon, you will see that this approach cannot be the end of our journey. And now I'm very happy to give the word to my panelists. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Does it work?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for being here. As you heard before, my interest in open design, and more specifically, is not just about the open design projects, but all the open processes and systems behind it. That means I'm not interested in just developing a product design or hardware design and make it open, but how the communities can self-organize and collaborate in designing the device or the product, and then manufacture it, distribute, and generate income, and become sustainable. So if you want, it's like the intangible side of open design, the hidden side that we are not aware of, but it's very important for making a project feasible and live longer. My background is industrial and service design, so more or less about hardware. But it's interesting to note how these principles, values, and processes are coming to design as well. And if you want to focus on the copyright side or on the intellectual property protection of design, it's quite tricky. If we talk about industrial design, it really depends on the country. There are a few ways for protecting it, but still is not really well developed. And in any case, if you modify a little bit the design, then the protection goes away. So it's still a little bit tricky to understand on how to protect or open existing or product design, because you can put the copyright on the drawing, but not what you manufacture starting from the drawing. That's the real point. One very interesting example actually comes from the fashion industry, because there the situation is clear, and it's clear also how we can use scoping as a strategy for learning and building a market. It's not really well known, but for example, in the fashion industry, there is a very low IP protection. Basically, yes, you can copyright the drawings, but not the product. The only thing that you can protect is the trademark of the brand. And actually, the same high-end design company are exploiting this fact, basically learning from each other, taking inspiration or copying. And that's the way basically they set the trends so quickly. So that's the way the fashion industry set trends every year, twice a year, and that's the way they sell a lot of products. They don't want anybody to know that, because of course they can sell them as the creative and geniuses brands actually create something new. But it's very useful for them to really be able to copy from their design. And it's interesting to know that the same approach goes also on the lower level of the fashion industry. If you take, for example, all the fast fashion companies like Zara and H&M, who are actually producing like similar dresses, but for more democratic audience because they're more low cost. Yes, they're copying, but sometimes you have the same designer working on the high-end design and fast fashion. So, for example, a few years ago in 2004, Karl Lagerfeld designed a line of clothes for H&M. So what's the point? I mean that they understood that this is just another market, if you want like the low-cost market or the market with low entry access. So basically they're exploiting this way of copying for and modifying the, each own project as a way for setting a market and setting trends and filling all the niches. The problem is that, of course, everything is hidden. We don't realize it. We don't know who started or where a project is coming from. So that's why I think it will be interesting to focus on visualizing and keeping track of all these processes. And I'm going back to Rwanda, because what I found really interesting in this project is the idea that you can link with the label on the product to all the information that's stored and allowed about the product. On the basic level, we can say that we can stack the author information, the version information, and the design files, but we can go further, and we could use this to store all the information about the manufacturing processes, that it's not just the manufacturing, but also the distribution, the supply chains, and how to manage the end of life of the product, because that's something that's really tricky. But you know, we have all these huge e-waste in Africa that are contaminating all the environment, and it's not clear how to recycle them. So it's really important to keep track of all these processes inside Rwanda or similar projects. One interesting project comes from MIT. It's called sourcemap.org. It's very interesting because it's an open source software for creating Google Map mashups for tracking of the supply chains of the product and their carbon footprint of the product. It's open source. You can embed and you can also download the data. So it's almost open data for keeping track of the life cycle of a product. And this is very important because if we talk about information, yes, information is very abundant. There is no scarcity or scarcity artificial, but when we want to bring open source or free software, collaborative processes and principles into the physical side, physical project, things are really different because material are increasingly scarce. So it's really important to keep in track of all the material flows and how to use them, because there are almost every resource is speaking, not just oil, but all the metals. Even wood in some regions, like in Malaysia, is speaking, because we are extracting wood at a quicker rate than the network itself can renew it. And for example, since few years already, some people have started to steal copper cables to resell it again. So for example, in January in the Netherlands, there was an accident because people stole like 300 meters of copper cable. So of course, it's very important to understand how can we be able to actually manufacture many open hardware projects if the materials are increasingly scarce. So it's really important to keep track of all the materials in the projects in order to recycle them, to reuse, or to decide collaboratively how to use them. And another, for example, aspect that's very important is to understand the real cost of producing a device or a product and how the money flows, because of course now is open hardware, open design is still in infancy, so we don't know really how they work. There is a common wisdom that there should be a way for designer makers or hackers to make a living out of their project. But if we actually look at the market of open hardware, basically the only one who are actually making a lot of money are like 10 companies, like Arduino, MakerBot are making like $1 million in revenue. And especially SparkFun was making like $20 million in revenue. So basically there's not small companies or individual makers that are making money out of it, but really companies that explode the long tail of the market. So what this means that it's very unlikely that you as a maker or open designer could make a living off your project right now, and this thing is quite hidden. I don't think maybe it's an economic problem. I think it's very bigger problems to address, but it's important to note how this money flows and this works. If you want, you can call it like open spending for open hardware. So to understand if it's true that we can have projects that's open and they can be sustainable in the future, not just environmentally, but also economically. So what's interesting for me for Ohanda is that basically it's like a way for gathering all the open data for open hardware and open design projects. And it's a really good way for understanding if a project works really well or it should be changed the way it works, also in terms of governance of the community and all of the processes.
Thank you, Jürgen, for the invitation, and thank you, Massimo, for your remarks. My name is Alison Powell, and I am a social scientist who studies the processes of making knowledge. That basically means I'm interested in ideas, where they come from, how they move around, and for the last couple of years I've been studying the ideas that have been moving around that have to do with hacking, making, openness, and freedom. So a few, maybe 18 months ago, I met with Jürgen and I said, you know, I'm really interested in this idea that open source should expand into other areas. And he said, well, it is interesting that you have this idea because I also had this idea. This happens often with Jürgen and me. And so he said, well, listen, and he said, this is what we have been thinking about. And he told me about Ohanda. And I went back and thought about it for a while, and I thought that there were some very interesting things about Ohanda as he has just presented to you, but then there were also some very problematic things about Ohanda, which maybe were not evident, and they're not evident if you're inside the process. And one of the reasons they're not evident if you're inside the process is that if I look around this room, I would say, how many people in this room think that open source is and open knowledge is generally a good idea? Okay, so this is our culture. This is the culture that we share. This is the culture that I would say broadly comes out of the free software principles that Richard Stallman articulated, and that has broadly also turned into a major force in the design of open source as a principle for software development. But we should not be distracted by the fact that this is a very particular kind of culture. It's a hacker culture, it's a maker culture, it's a technical culture, and it's a culture that, as far as open source is concerned, is very much concerned with software development processes. Why has open source been so transformative? It is partly because of the unique principles and features of software. Software is code. It's easy to reproduce, and it's easy to reuse, and it is a digital object and a piece of thought that has, unless you count the sort of server cycles to reproduce it, a very low cost of reproduction and a very low cost of storage. So these are features of a particular kind of object that has around it a particular kind of culture. And that particular kind of culture has developed its own values. And I would say that for me, the principles of free software are a very good expression of a set of shared values of people who have come together and worked on a particular kind of they've been using a particular kind of values to work on a particular kind of object. And so I'm actually very happy to follow Massimo, because Massimo just described a different culture, and he described an entirely different economic model that is based on a culture of innovation in fashion and individualization in fashion. So there are some parallels with code, but the fact is that aside from the basic design of a garment, there is nothing that is necessarily going to be shared as shared and infinitely reproducible base code, if you like, for fashion. I mean, we know what a pair of trousers looks like, but there is no repository of basic trousers that you then draw upon to create bespoke trousers. This is, yeah. So in a sense then, when we're trying to work from software to hardware, we are moving from one kind of culture into another kind of culture. And it is not just that it is material, it is actually that there are some principles that as a group of people in this room, we hold that are connected with the very particular aspects of making software and by extension, making intellectual goods that can be reproduced at very low cost and stored at very low cost. So those are some elements of culture. And then there are elements of process that I think are very interesting if we think about how this idea of open culture is moving from one space to another. The idea of open culture and the idea of maintaining a commons comes not only from the idea of a commons of the sort of common land that is free for people to use, but also in the way that we think about it in the sort of open knowledge field comes also from the process of collaboratively developing code. So collaborative production, again, is quite different than what Massimo outlined in terms of the fashion industry. It is possible to do collaborative projects based on a shared repository of code. It's less possible to develop other kinds of things using purely collaborative processes. So the next thing we need to think about as we are trying to consider how we extend principles of openness from software culture to other cultures are the issues of process. What does collaboration mean? Who and how is involved in this process? Are processes different? Is the kind of culture that is developing around making an open moon lander different than the kind of culture that is going to be using an open design for a stove and potentially innovating upon that design for a stove to make it appropriate for a particular village in which it's windier than the village next door? So we have again this kind of question of forms of knowledge. We have a question again of how is that knowledge being transformed into production? Is it being transformed into production by, for example, the process of building software is a process of iteration, of checking for bugs and looking to see whether it runs. If it runs, it runs. It might not be the most beautiful code, but it runs. So therefore we assume that that's a positive outcome. There are not necessarily parallels to this in every area. Again, if we think about the ways that we produce material objects, it is very important that a toaster works under all conditions, not just that a toaster makes toast once, that is runs, but that a toaster can be counted on to do many complex things under extreme conditions. So again, we have this sort of question of like, what kind of process are we going to make? And if we are going to extend our principles of openness, to what extent do they need to be pushed outside of the culture from which they come from? And the final thing I wanted to address is the kind of outcomes that we are expecting from extending some of the principles from the open, a certain kind of open production culture in software. What are we actually trying to address? Are we trying to recreate a commons in order to challenge the models of intellectual property in all areas? Are we trying to create a commons because we think that we need to have a knowledge commons in which everybody can freely contribute their knowledge and freely be able to access the knowledge of others? Those are very different. Those are also very different problems. In a knowledge commons, we have lots of existing forms of knowledge commons, and some of them are called universities, and some of them are called community organizations, and some of them are called public libraries. And then if we are thinking about making collaborative products together, there may be other existing models that we can use besides assuming that there is a software model. So I think there are some very interesting challenges for me as an open thinker in what Ohanda has introduced to us. I think there are some really interesting ways that we can think about open knowledge, but there are also ways in which we must be able to think about what is different about different kinds of open knowledge and what kinds of techniques are appropriate for developing strategies to open knowledge in different areas. And so before I pass on to Dannie, I've been thinking about what we might want to think about if we are going to think about developing a standard for open hardware. And these would be based, what kinds of principles would we want to develop for a standard for open hardware? And I think that the principles would have to be based on an acknowledgement that there are values in what we are designing, an acknowledgement that there are larger ethical issues and issues of justice in our process, and an acknowledgement that the outcomes of some kind of outcome. So I would say that what we would want for our, potentially in the future for open hardware, based on not just on software culture, but on many other cultures, is something that is transparent, extensible, as in it can be applied in many different situations, and we think about the outcomes in many different situations. And finally, that it be just, because I think, as Massimo articulated, the issues that are at stake for our open processes are actually very much larger than the ones that we have been considering so far, and they include issues of sustainability and of care for our entire world community.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you for the invitation to be here. And before I start, I would like to know how many of you have ever read or looked at the patent specification, a document. A patent specification is the technical term, it's just the patent script. So, more than I expected, congratulations. I work as the science advisor at the World Trade Institute, and we are in the law faculty, and more specifically in international economic law, environmental law, and world trade law. Now, this is all horrible. At least it sounds horrible until you know that I'm, by training, I studied chemistry and physics, and I'm a former patent examiner of the Swiss Patent Office. And I have the great privilege that in my work to engage with areas of law that the lawyers don't know where to begin with, and that's patent law. A normal lawyer would not engage in patent law, is to specialize in areas very complex. It's also an area of sometimes of great frustration. So that's so that you know where I'm coming from and where I'm speaking from. When I first heard Jürgen speak about the OWANDA and the idea of an unregistered trademark, I got very uneasy, because I said, no, wait a minute, this is hardware. A trademark gives you absolutely or very little and very limited protection. Needless to say that a digital good and the physical good are different in their properties. They are different kinds of, say, you could, among IT people, I can use the word of logical categories. They are different in their logic. So you need, if you want to go towards the open source for hardware, you got to do a little bit of thinking. And in my perhaps not so humble opinion, the trademark is not going to cut it for you, not alone. Okay, not alone. I'm not excluding it. I think it's, in terms of intellectual property, is a valuable tool. And Shell and Coca-Cola will tell you that. And Coca-Cola is a very good example for those who do not know. It's a trade secret. The formula, it's not patented. Their value is in the trademark and the trade secret. Okay? But that's not the direction you want to go. So what is it? When I heard Jürgen, what came off the top of my head due to my engagement with the WTO law and all that sort of thing, and my knowledge of patents, is that you should be thinking in terms of a private label standard. And all of those three words are important: private, label, and standard. And the private is very simple to explain. It has to do with the fact that it's not a government standard, that is coming from a private, an NGO, a foundation, or even a commercial company. The labeling is a very big issue, and any of you, especially those who live in Germany, you are familiar with the bio label. Most of you are familiar with the FSC label for wood products. Those are private labels, and they are fabrication and production standards. that correspond to standards. Now, and then we come to this big chapter, standards. Standards, you know, you all know standards. You all know protocols, especially in information technology. Interoperability is dependent on standards and setting standards. So what is this idea of having a standard for open hardware? What does that mean? Well, that comes from my motivation for proposing that is in order to preempt the possibility that somebody wanting to copy or appropriate some nice open standard hardware, you need to first document it in a way that if that pirate, I'll use the word pirate, wants to appropriate your hardware and runs to the patent office and tries to get a patent for it, even if he gets a patent, it's not going to be a valid patent because you have proof and you can on the record that you have published how this thing is built, what it's made, how it's made, what the process is for it, and what it is. So a standard, as I mean it for open source hardware, is really, you basically steal the idea of a patent specification and you put it under a standard. And that's the standard which your label, your registration in OAND guarantees. So, and this is very important because don't let me start about all the ways that the patent system is broken. It's broken in many ways. But it is a legacy system, it's one you have to deal with. So don't throw away the kid with the bathwater. In addition, since what is almost perverse is that patent specifications are actually part of the public domain. Okay, they are not copyrighted. It's one of the few pieces of published paper which are not copyrighted, like laws are not copyrighted. So you can use any expired patent, and patents have a maximum according to TRIPS, which is WTO law, and over 160 countries adhere to, a maximum validity of 20 years with a few exceptions in pharmaceuticals, which can get people upset. And after those 20 years, not only is the document in the public domain, you are free to fabricate it and use it for further development. So there is a lot even there to learn from there in the open hardware drive. The standards also have to have an open standard, a private label open standard is also, it gives you transparency. It assures that you can destroy the novelty of any unscrupulous copier or pirate. And it does contribute significantly to the public domain, which is what you want to do. You want to bring the public domain back to the public in a way that it can be useful for everybody. Within the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there are two covenants, and one of the covenants, Article 15, the one for economic, social, and cultural rights, gives you that access that every individual has the right to access to science and the benefits of science, which is really a very nice way of understanding the public domain. And however, what is new here is that you're going beyond science, you're going to technology. But that's good. I mean, science and technology are converging at a very fast rate. That's it.
Yeah, so thank you all very much for your contributions. And we only have 15 minutes left now, I think. And so I would like to open the discussion to the audience instead of making a second round here on the panel, because I think it's more interesting to have some inputs or questions from your side.
Questions, please. Over there. I'll start with you. Please use the microphone for the sake of the video recording.
I would like to know how much conflicts are there with real patents. Like, for example, if you're publishing something and then someone comes and says, well, but that's patent so-and-so.
If I understood your question correctly, if you publish something and somebody says, oh no, I think in general you cannot give an answer. You'd have to look at the specifics of the case, because if really that's, and you maybe bring up a very valid point, is that whenever you develop hardware, there's a certain due diligence that you have to do in establishing that it's new. It's not just, it's very tricky. In patents, it's impossible to do. That's why software patents are wonderful in a way, because infringement is extremely difficult to prove. In hardware, infringement is harder to prove, but if you're reading the judgments coming out of the Supreme Court and that sort of thing, they're clamping down in which obviousness is a lot harder to prove these days. It's easier to prove, actually. If you are a person skilled in a particular technology, then it's a matter of combining elements together. It's obvious, it's not violating anybody's patent.
Yeah, but there are also regional patents, and so what do you do in this case?
What do you mean regional?
That you have something is patented in one country, for example, and then you publish it it's a global network, so what happens in this case?
Oh, the jurisdiction is always national, okay? So if you, there's not much of a problem that I see, if I understand your, in the country where it's published. And if there is indeed an infringement with the patent, a conflict with the patent in that jurisdiction, whoever wants to produce at the commercial scale could not. At the private scale, you can always produce something. If it's for your own personal use, you can take anything that is patent under the sun and that the patent is enforced, and you can produce it for your own private use. That a patent only gives you the right to exclude a third party from commercial exploitation of your invention.
Thank you. Next question here.
Thank you. Again, referring to patent law, the basic difference between copyright and patent is that, there we can speak about open source because we have a source to disclose, which is sometimes closed. But with patent law, we have the disclosure. So the main problem about patents are basically the aspects relating to the condition of licenses or the refusal to licenses. So, your proposal referring to these private standards, in which way, can be in relation with the problem of licenses for patented goods?
If I understand your question correctly, and please correct me, I'm going to try to rephrase your question. There are conflicts between, let's say there are industrial conflicts about whether a company can get a license from some technology that is patent or not.
Because open source basically, grow from, software area, where, is copyrighted basically. In some, countries there are always also patents, but open source really comes from copyright area. And now we are trying to, switch and also to apply to patent law area. But, in patent law, there is a misnomer about open source because, one of the basic requirements for having a patent is disclosure. So the problem in relation with patented stuff is that, is in relation with the condition of licenses. So that's why I'm asking you in which way, your proposal for private standards can be a solution.
But I don't see the problem with the licenses on hardware based on patents, because there isn't a real problem. If a patent is in force and is valid, it's the patent owner's discretion.
It's part of the commercial exploitation, also deciding how to license a good.
Right.
It's not only, setting the price, but also deciding if license it or not.
Right.
So that's why.
That's what the monopoly right of a patent is about. Now, and the other thing that I may not have made very clear is that the specification is part of the public domain, because that is the deal. You get the monopoly, but you have to tell me what your invention is about. That's what the public gets. But I think we all respect the law to some point, and some patents are valid, and there are very inventive people there, and they should have their right to their patent in 20 years. And throughout history, scientists have made decisions about whether to patent or not to patent, okay? Those are individual decisions. But I think here the shift, and what is difficult to get one's head around, is that you're going beyond the single individual to a collaborative effect, to a collaborative invention, to collaborative creation. And then the individual, the legal part of a patent, we can throw that away. Right now we are interested in the technical part, which is just the record of what the invention is about.
Yeah, because I'm a lawyer, that's why.
That's why you make things complicated. Thank you very much. Other questions, please, over there.
Actually,
I'm coming.
can I interject on that? I think that the other thing, too, is that if we think about this as a kind of negotiation at a boundary between a few different groups of people with different ways of thinking about things, it becomes a little bit clearer what's at stake. So we have a sort of culture in which collaboration and collaborative production has been made very easy, and therefore we have a kind of culture in which the baseline is collaboration around a commons. And the commons is easy to manage because of the features, the specific features of the things that this collaborative culture is working on. And we're trying to negotiate on the boundary of that culture and community of practice and another, or perhaps several, including potentially designers who are designing individual products, and also a whole set of different kinds of markets to which patent law has evolved to match. So I think that's part of the reason that these questions get very, very tricky.
Okay. Klaus Zinser. I'm, let's say, a little introduced to the whole idea of 3D printers to reproduce the parts. And also I would like to mention there is a very good document from Adrian Boyer about the protection, what's possible to produce, what's not allowed. For example, there is also a difference between the States and in Europe. I think in the States it's not allowed even for private use to reproduce the mirror of a car if it's protected. But these are minor issues. What I would like to get to know, is the whole idea of Ohanda, not only to protect the product, but also to give the information, the drawings, to give the information how these components are produced, that I'm able, with the knowledge that's documented, to reproduce the whole product, that it's relatively easy, because I could also go in the way and say, hey, I have this product, but with patents I can have a part patented and the other is still protected by knowledge how I produce it, what the pharmaceutical industry is doing. Coca-Cola is the complete difference because they keep everything secret, and there is also middle way. So I think if Honda wants to go in this direction, expired patents would be a good thing. Also products there which are not sold anymore. And to give all the knowledge, it means the whole manufacturing process, the drawings, to the public, that it can be reproduced. Thanks.
Well, that's exactly what we are aiming for. The aim of Honda is that if designers or manufacturers decide to design something or construct something which should go into the public domain and should be reproduced by others, and maybe even allow other people to have commercial success on this product, that's exactly the freedom that we are willing to grant to the public. So there's no limitations at all, and I really think you are right that that's something I learned from Dannie as well, that patents that are run out of life cycle are a good pool of things and technologies that are exactly what we are trying to do with Honda. Yes.
Thank you. So I think we've got room for just one short question. Anybody else? Then you go.
Okay, it's a kind of second part to my first question. So did I get this right? If you register something at Honda, then this means no one else can put a patent on this?
Exactly. If we do it the right way. So that's why I think that I think we should really have a deeper look into the way patents are written, because that's like the sort of blueprint that we need to use. And then we make use of the patent system in the sense of its codification of the products, but we just publish it to the public domain with a valid timestamp, as I learned. And so from that moment on, nobody can put a patent on it anymore.
Thank you for that. So with that, I'd like to draw this session to a close and just put in a little plug that in the afternoon, right after lunch, we're going to have the opportunity to continue the discussion on an international private standard for open source hardware, and that will be in workshop 2. Thank you very much.